In today's gospel reading, we do have Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount that we hear in Matthew. So in Luke's version, it is on a plain, so on a flat space, and so it's entitled the Sermon on the Plain. And particularly today, we have the corresponding part to Matthew's Beatitudes, where Matthew has 9 of those Beatitudes. In Luke's gospel, we have 4 Beatitudes and then also 4 woes, right, that we heard today. Beatitude was a way in which in the Hebrew scriptures, in the Old Testament, that certain things could be encouraged, right? We heard in today from Jeremiah, in the first reading from Jeremiah, that blessed are those who trust in the Lord. In the responsorial psalm, we sang, blessed are those who hope in the Lord. And it also said in the responsorial psalm, blessed are those who follow not the ways of the wicked, right? And so there are many, many Beatitudes like that in the Old Testament. And what it says is like, here's what you're blessed if you do, and you're supposed to do this thing, right? So Jesus' hearers would have been very familiar with the Beatitude as a method of teaching, of sharing what we should do. They would not have been familiar with the content of today's Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor. Blessed are the hungry. Blessed are the weeping. Blessed are those who are hated. Right? These things would not have been held up in the Old Testament as things worth doing or choosing or following. And so in today's gospel reading, in some ways, Jesus was being unruly. Everybody say unruly. So he was defying their expectations. What they would have expected a rabbi or a preacher to say, they are not hearing from him. He is doing something outside of the box when he uses these things for poverty and hunger and grief and hatred for being things that you would try to emulate or you would try to do. And oftentimes, in Jesus' day, it happens just as much as it does today, we try to really make God fit into our box. And today's gospel reading shows us that God is beyond that, right? We don't want to try to create God in our own image, but we've been made in God's image, and we seek to become what he created us to be. But God is other. He doesn't just fit into all of our desires, our wants, our opinions, our political beliefs, or anything else, right? God is God apart from us. About 3.5 years ago, I did a backpacking trip to the Wallowa mountain range in northeastern Oregon. And I went with my cousin and a friend. And when we went on the backpacking trip, we were there for 5 days. And on the last day, we camped next to a lake. There are many mountain lakes that are called this, but it was called Glacier Lake. And so we were camping next to Glacier Lake. And as we had already set up camp and we were just sitting there, we had a visit from a 300 or 350-pound mountain goat that took a keen interest in our campsite. And so he started to approach, and he got closer, and then he kind of paused, and then he went a little bit closer, and I was getting nervous, right? Eventually, he would even come back later at night after one of my friends had gone to sleep, and he would pass like 10 to 15 feet between us. And I was very anxious, and I have been in backcountry encounters, about 10 of them, with bears at varying distances, right? And I know what to do if it's a bear. I know how you act and how you respond and how you protect yourself when you do that kind of thing. But I had no idea what to do about a mountain goat. I had not prepared for that. And so for the record, if a mountain goat approaches you in the backcountry, you make yourself big, you make noise, you can back away slowly if they keep coming towards you, and then if that doesn't work, then you throw rocks at them, right? Now you know, and you learned something at Mass today. But I didn't know that, right? I didn't know what you were supposed to do, and so I was very anxious, and so I thought, how can I deal with my anxiety? And I thought, what is something non-threatening? And so in my mind came Casper the Friendly Ghost. And so I actually named the goat Walter. I thought, nobody's afraid of a Walter. And so it was Walter the Friendly Goat. And so that helped me ease my anxiety. But sometimes what we try to do is tame God, right? And God's a lot more like a wild goat than a kitten. See? And so God is more like a wild goat than a kitten or a domesticated pet, right? And so we try sometimes to put God in that little box, that we want him to be more tame, more like we want to have a little bit of control over God. And God really doesn't work that way. The gospel reading today shows us that God is much beyond our expectations. Now, I told this story when I first got back at a school mass. And so one of the school families actually gave me a goat. And they actually put a little name tag on him that says Walter, right? And so now he sits in my office all the time, but this is a lot more comfortable than a real mountain goat coming into your camp, right? And sometimes this is what we want God to be. We want God to be this safe, little, comfortable thing. But God goes beyond our expectations, challenges us sometimes to go beyond our own desires, our needs, our wants, our safety. God moves us into a place of sometimes risk. Father Loy. Good catch. And when God moves us that way, we can respond. You see, to love, which is the response to God, to love is risky business. Right? It requires us being vulnerable. It requires us being open. It requires the possibility of rejection. God loves us, and he's opened himself up to us, and he made himself vulnerable, and he faces the possibility that we can reject him. For us, it's the same thing, and it's a little scary. And a lot of times what we want to do is substitute something else for love, for having to risk love. And so we may do that with all kinds of things, with pleasure, popularity, potency, power, prestige, privilege. All of these things are a substitute for love, or a substitute for what God desires from us. In today's gospel reading, when Jesus talks about being poor and hungry and grieving and hated, I think what he is showing us is that we have to be empty. We have to embrace a poverty that allows the center of our hearts to be open and have room for the other, to have room for him and room for one another. Right? We can't try to substitute that vulnerability by replacing it with something else that we can control or that gives us security or stability. We have to be open to that poverty that allows us to receive what God has to give. As we come to this Eucharist, it really is about being conformed to Christ, about being transformed, and so that our hearts, our lives, our decisions aren't what we just want to do or what we think we're comfortable with, but it moves us outside of that into what God might be calling us to. We're not here to conform God to us, to our image, to our expectation, as if God were sort of the best of humanity. We're here to be conformed to him, to do his will, and to be loved, so that we may likewise love. As we come to receive Christ in this Eucharist, may we become what we receive.